Hello, I'm Charles Flanagan, and this is Bristol, once described by former Bristol, Tennessee Mayor Wesley Davis and others as the town so big it takes two states to hold it. Almost everyone knows that the state line between Tennessee and Virginia is the very center of State Street, the main street in our community. Most of you probably know many stories about the disputes about the location of that state line, such as the Waterworks War over 100 years ago and other disputes that we now find somewhat humorous. I suspect not many are aware of the legal history behind the location of the state line, and that's what I would like to discuss with you here today. Our story begins with the formation of the colonies of Virginia and Carolina. The very existence of those colonies depended on royal charters which were issued by the King of England, whichever king was on the throne at the time. There were a number of those charters, but today I want to focus you on the charter of King Charles II, which was issued 1665. It was that charter that last attempted to establish the boundary between the colony of Virginia and the colony of Carolina. King Charles provided that that dividing line would be 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude from sea to sea. By 1710, settlements along the border between these two colonies had grown to the point that both of the colonial governors decided that it was necessary for the boundary line to move from the paper of the charter to monuments on the ground, so people would know where Virginia was and where Carolina was. However, it was 1728 before any meaningful survey took place. That survey proceeded from the coast 237 miles west to Pee Creek, a tributary of the Dan River in what is now Patrick County, Virginia. 21 years later, in 1749, 90 more miles were added to the boundary line that took it to Steep Rock Creek, which was near White Top Mountain. That survey was made by Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson. Yes, the same Peter Jefferson who was the father of Thomas Jefferson. In 1779 and 1780, the line proceeded on to the Cumberland Gap from Patrick County, Virginia. And of course, that's the segment of the boundary line that affects us right here in Bristol. I said that line, actually there were two lines. A line drawn by the surveyors for the colony of Virginia and a line drawn by the surveyors for Carolina. And they did not match. Each contended that they reflected more closely 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, but they were about 2 miles apart for most of that trek. So how were the surveyors so far off from running this line of 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude? Well, there are many stories and lots of speculation about how that came to be, and they range from too much alcohol available for the surveyors, too little alcohol available for the surveyors, too hot, too cold, too many rattlesnakes, too many copperheads, too many mosquitoes, too many ticks, too much mountainous terrain. That's not even speaking to getting through the Great Dismal Swamp on the eastern part of the state. It was also speculated that iron ore in the mountain ranges affected the equipment that was involved. Their equipment was entirely different than what we have today. When it's cloudy and overcast and they can't get the proper shootings on the stars, that affected their ability to run a proper line. Lastly, and perhaps not leastly, some of the property owners that they were running these lines through had very strong feelings on whether they wanted to be in Carolina or whether they wanted to be in Virginia. And one way or the other, they exercised appropriate influences on the surveyors, or so it is speculated, to make the lines meander in the way they did. So the next event was 1796, when Tennessee became a state. And of course, the lands of Tennessee came from the lands of Carolina. In 1802, the state of Tennessee and the state of Virginia both agreed that it was necessary to finally establish the location of their boundary line. And another survey was commissioned. One of the participants in that survey was a local figure, John Sevier. The 1802 survey line became known as the Diamond Line, and in essence it was a compromise line between the Virginia line and the Carolina line. Those lines, by the way, were referred to as the Henderson line for Carolina after Richard Henderson, and the Walker line for the Virginia line named after Thomas Walker. So the Diamond Line, the Compromise Line of 1802, pretty well split the difference. Monuments were created and the blazes were placed on the trees marking the boundary line at that time. Of course, what was happening here in 1802? Not that much, so there wasn't any definitive understanding by many people as to where this line went. In 1852, Joseph Anderson first released his plat of the streets for his planned community of Bristol. It didn't take long for a dispute to arise as to whether Joseph Anderson intended for the main street of the city to be entirely within the state of Tennessee. Perhaps most people thought that was the intent. Some thought the intent was for the state line to be the center of Main Street. There were some monuments nearby that indicated the 1802 line was actually a little further south than the center line of the main street for the town of Bristol. In any event, it created a problem, but we lived with the problem for a while. By the 1880s, Bristol was bustling. The economy had great anticipation with iron ore, coal, timber. The railroad was coming. It was becoming very essential that we know exactly where this state line was. In the late 1880s, a gentleman named Rufus Ayers was the Attorney General of Virginia. Rufus Ayers had connections to our locality. He actually grew up in Bristol as a young boy, attending school there. As a man, he opened a law office in Estelville, Virginia, now Gate City, and then he became Attorney General. So he was well familiar with the necessity and importance of getting this state line issue resolved. So he filed suit in the name of the Commonwealth of Virginia against the state of Tennessee in the U.S. Supreme Court. Yes, I said he filed the suit in the U.S. Supreme Court, for under our Constitution, disputes between states were given to the U.S. Supreme Court as a matter of original jurisdiction. One of the few occasions when the Supreme Court acts as a trial court and not just as an appellate court. Virginia took an interesting position in connection with that litigation. First, they acknowledged that yes, the state of Tennessee and the state of Virginia had agreed upon a compromise line in 1802. And by their legislatures in 1803, each had ratified that as the boundary line between them. The problem was, according to the Virginia litigation, nobody knew where that 1802 line went when it got to Bristol. Monuments had been lost, trees were cut, any other monuments or markings simply could not be located, at least within the immediate area. So Virginia took the position that the line could not be established in the town of Bristol. Further, Virginia took the position that even if it could be, the agreement was invalid and not effective to change the state boundary. Under our Constitution, for two states to enter into an agreement, it must be consented to by Congress or ratified by Congress. And Virginia took the position that there was no consent by Congress for this agreement of 1802. And such, in fact, was the case. No formal consent had ever been given by the Congress of the United States. So Virginia contended that that's simply out the window. And what the Supreme Court should do was simply go back to the King Charles Charter, announce that the location of the state line was 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude, and appoint surveyors to locate that if it were necessary. Numerous depositions were taken in connection with the 1802 compromise line to demonstrate that there was an inability to demonstrate precisely where that line was when it got to the town of Bristol. In 1893, April 1893, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its opinion. In essence, it said, don't bother us with this problem. You all agreed, you all being the state of Virginia and the Commonwealth of Virginia, you agreed in 1802, as evidenced by acts of your legislatures in 1803, to the state boundary line, and that the U.S. Congress impliedly consented to that agreement. That was demonstrated by the fact that Congress would in fact seat congressmen elected from the northeast portion of Tennessee and the southwest portion of Virginia. So the U.S. Supreme Court said the line is where you agreed in 1802, now go home and live with it. Unfortunately, as you know, as I've already stated, nobody could agree where that line was when it got to the city of Bristol. 7 years pass. In 1900, the parties are back before the U.S. Supreme Court, once again saying we can't agree upon the line. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1900 appointed 3 commissioners to establish that line, no new line, but the line of 1802 as best they could from the monuments they could find. They appointed a surveyor from Virginia, one from Tennessee, and one from Massachusetts to establish that line. In 1901, cooler heads prevailed and the state of Tennessee ceded to the Commonwealth of Virginia that portion of the disputed property that was north of the center line of the main street in the city of Bristol. That agreement between the state of Tennessee and the state of Virginia was ratified and consented to by the U.S. Congress March 3, 1901, thus bringing to an end the long line of disputes over the exact location of the state line, particularly as it passed through Bristol. In 1903, the U.S. Supreme Court, who had appointed commissioners in 1900, gave its stamp of approval for this compact as well, just to make sure that all loose ends were taken care of. Thus, there have been no further disputes over the location of the state line in the city of Bristol. I invite you to take a look at a map of the state of Tennessee and look closely at the northern boundary of that state from east to west. It hardly looks like a straight line following 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. Take a particular look at the portion of the northern boundary between the Mississippi River and the Tennessee River. You will note that it is substantially further south than the remaining portion of the northern boundary. That lower portion of the northern boundary of the state of Tennessee is 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. So here we are in 2011, 110 years after the Congress of the United States finally established the state line separating Tennessee and Virginia as it's located in the city of Bristol. I wonder what it would be like if we found where the line of King Charles went through the city of Bristol today, with all citizens having access to GPS equipment and computer programming that enables them to find latitude and longitude readings. I have located the approximate site of 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. For BTN TV, I'm Charles Flanagan.